China calls for deepening cooperation with Latin American and Caribbean countries at an important gathering in Beijing. Hello, I'm Arun Naidu, and this is The Heat. President Xi Jinping delivered a keynote speech at the opening ceremony of the fourth ministerial meeting of the China-CELAC Forum in Beijing. China pledged about $9 billion in credit to developing Latin American and Caribbean states and set out initiatives to deepen cooperation in infrastructure and clean energy. We begin our coverage with this report from Beijing.
President Xi reflected on how over the past decade, the China-CELAC Forum has grown from a budding initiative into a strong and thriving platform. He emphasized the spirit of win-win cooperation, with both China and CELAC members deepening ties in trade, investment, finance, science and technology, and infrastructure. Xi said China and Latin American nations have championed true multilateralism, defended global fairness and justice, pushed for reform of the international governance system, and promoted the development of a multipolar world and more democratic international relations. He said that China and Latin America have built a community with a shared future characterized by mutual respect, mutual benefit, openness and inclusivity, and focused on improving people's lives. President Xi emphasized that as changes unseen in a century are accelerating and multiple risks are intertwined, countries can only maintain world peace and stability and promote global development and prosperity by working together. He warned that there are no winners in tariff and trade wars, and that acts of bullying and hegemony will only result in self-isolation. Highlighting that both China and Latin American and Caribbean countries are key members of the Global South, he underscored their shared values of independence, development and justice. Xi announced China's readiness to work with Latin America by launching 5 key projects to deepen ties, including projects for unity, development, civilization, peace and people-to-people exchanges. President Xi concluded by calling on both sides to open a new chapter of cooperation.
中国有句古诗，人生乐在乡之心。
As an ancient Chinese poem says, the pleasure of life lies in having bosom friends. A Latin American proverb echoes the sentiment, a friend is a treasure. No matter how the world changes, China will always be a trusted friend and reliable partner to Latin America and the Caribbean. Let us join hands to advance our modernization journeys and write a new chapter in our shared future.
Leaders from Colombia, Brazil, Chile and other countries praised China's contributions to regional cooperation and socio-economic development in the region. They reaffirmed support for the One China principle and Xi's vision of a shared future for humanity.
For more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Boston is Jorge Heine. He's the former Chilean ambassador to China and a research professor at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies. And John Gong is a professor of economics at the University of International Business and Economics. Thanks to both of you for being with us. John, let me start with you. Trade between China and Latin American and Caribbean nations exceeded $500 billion for the first time in 2024. President Xi discussed several areas of cooperation in his address. What stood out for you in his speech?
Well, I think President Xi, this is after his very successful visit, I believe it's the end of last year, to Peru and a couple of other, and Brazil as well. And I think China's cooperation with that part of the world, Latin America, has been strengthened over the years, especially I think after the opening up of the Chanque port in Peru. That opens a wide range of opportunities for other surrounding countries, particularly actually the northern part of Brazil. I think the challenge is really with respect to Washington. President Trump's national security team has adopted essentially what I call a hemispheric approach towards that area, that part of the world. I would argue this is essentially the reincarnation of the Monroe Doctrine. Look at what the Secretary of State Marco Rubio has done in Panama. After his visit in Panama, immediately withdraw from China's Belt and Road Initiative. I think this is the kind of challenge that China has to deal with moving forward. I think the board is very much in the side of these countries in Latin America, whether they want to continue to maintain this very prosperous and fruitful relationship with China.
Ambassador Heine, good to see you as well. President Xi also addressed the United States tariff regime in his address, and this is what the Chinese president had to say. He said there are no winners in tariff wars or trade wars. Bullying or hegemonism only leads to self-isolation. President Xi urged countries to stand united. How do you think this message was received by the nations of Latin America and the Caribbean?
Well, I will say this. For Latin America and the Caribbean, free trade is extremely important. Our countries signed free trade agreements, depend very heavily on exports and foreign direct investment. So free trade is very significant for Latin America. And let me underscore the following. As it happens, I was in Beijing at the first China-CELAC ministerial meeting that took place in January of 2015. And at the time, President Xi announced that over the next 10 years, trade between China and Latin America would double from $250 billion at the time to $500 billion in 2025. Now, it's interesting to note that that is exactly what happened. A lot of people are very skeptical at the time that we would see such a considerable increase, but we have seen that. So, and today for South America, to your point, China is the #1 trading partner, not for Latin America as a whole, but for South America, and certainly for Brazil, for Chile, for Peru, for Uruguay. A country like Brazil exports almost $100 billion to China, 37 billion just in soybean and soybean oil. So these are very significant figures, and our region depends very heavily on free trade.
And Ambassador, looking at the tariffs that the United States has imposed, if we look at the manner in which it was done, the speed with which it was done, do you think it's going to forge a stronger relationship between Latin America and China?
Well, I will say this. Economics has its own imperative. Our region needs development. Our region needs more trade. It needs more investment. According to some projections, by 2035, trade between China and Latin America will reach $750 billion. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And let me also say the following. One area that I think is very significant, and this is one area in which President Petro, Colombia, who chairs CELAC and is in Beijing these days attending the China-CELAC Ministerial Forum, he has emphasized the transition to a green economy and green energy. And that, of course, is an area in which China and Chinese companies have significant advantages in wind and solar and green hydrogen and electric mobility. And our countries in South America, including Chile, which has a lot of copper and a lot of lithium, have the minerals that are needed for that. So I think that is an area that will be extremely significant in the course of the next few years for China-Latin American relations.
John Gong, of course, these talks in Beijing, this meeting, this forum comes right after the Geneva negotiations between US and Chinese trade officials, which saw the rollback of some of those tariffs that will last 90 days. So what was the Chinese message, in your view, to the countries in Beijing for the forum?
Well, I think the outcome of that negotiation speaks loud and clear that the way to deal with Washington is to really negotiate from a position of strength. I think China's approach is very unique. After President Trump essentially initiated this trade war against the entire world, especially its major trading partners, its allies, all of them, he is waging this tariff war against everyone. China's approach is very different in that China, stands up and say, we're going to retaliate. This sets a very good example as to how to negotiate with Washington. You have to argue for your position with dignity and, expecting respect from Washington. Negotiate as equal partners. Now, granted, this is still temporary. Essentially, we're buying some time for 90 days to work out a much broader people describe it as a grand bargain. Hopefully, it's a grand bargain. But I think it provides some clues as to how this negotiation is going, in which direction. Clearly, it's going to be a direction that respects both sides, and a direction that put both sides on equal footing. I think this is actually very important.
Ambassador, if we look at the U.S. tariffs, they've already undermined global supply chains. I mean, we see that there have been a number of companies, major companies in the United States, that have cancelled orders. There are ships that are still anchored in Chinese ports, not sailing to the United States with their goods. Los Angeles port says May imports have dropped by 25%. I mean, if we take a country like Chile as an example, how is all of this affecting the global economy?
Well, as you know, Chile is a country that has the largest number of FTAs of any country in the world. Chile has around 30 FTAs with some 65 countries. So we pioneered bilateral FTAs. We believe very strongly in free trade. And our economy depends on free trade. We have a small internal market, only 19 million people. So for us, the sort of dismantling of the existing trading order is very problematic. Now, Chile sends around 40% of its exports to China, which is something that President Boric has emphasized. President Boric, of course, of Chile is in Beijing right now for the CELAC China Ministerial Forum. So for us, the Chinese market is extremely important, but obviously it's not the only one. We also trade a lot with the United States, with European countries, with other countries, Japan and others. So the point is this. Chile believes very much in a multilateral trading order. We think it is important to do something and strengthen the World Trade Organization, which has been, basically moribund over the past few years, because not just Chile's prosperity, but Latin American and the global South prosperity depends on an established trading order. So I think that it's an important topic that should be put on the table, and hopefully China and Latin America can work together on it.
John, looking at the tariffs again, I mean, it would appear that China had some kind of fallback plan, a safety net, if you like, because if we look at Chinese exports, surged in April by 9.3%, that's year on year. The shortfall in exports to the United States was made up by higher increased exports to the countries of Southeast Asia. I mean, to what extent will that mitigate the impact of the U.S. tariffs on China?
Yeah, and that statistic actually surprised me greatly as well. I'm really puzzled as to how comes that the exports to other countries actually makes up more than the drop of Chinese exports to the United States. I think this is, certainly it's a pleasant surprise. But I suspect that some of it is, of course, is more imports, more demand from these countries for Chinese products. But some of it probably is also related to sort of essentially, bypassing the tariffs and going another way back to the United States. That's also possible.
Okay, Ambassador, I've just got a little bit of time left, about a minute. I want to talk about the specific relationship between Brazil and China. Of course, as you pointed out, President Lula was at the forum in Beijing. It's also part of a state visit that President Lula is making to China. Now, Brazil and China signed something like 20 agreements, including deals on agricultural exports from Brazil to China. Here is President Lula speaking at the forum. Let's watch.
Either we come together and look for partners who want to build a shared world together with us, or Latin America will remain a region that represents the poverty of today's world.
So, Ambassador, how significant are these trade agreements for Brazil?
Well, as I said earlier, trade between China and Brazil is approaching now $200 billion. Brazil exports to China, last figures I saw, $96 billion. Soybeans, beef, oil, significant amounts of natural resources. And therefore, for the Brazilian economy, the relationship with China is absolutely central. But not just in trade, but also in investment. What we are seeing is this year, we'll see the establishment of two major electric car factories in Brazil, of Chinese BYD and Great Wall Motors, one in the Northeast, another in Sao Paulo. And that is part of what I said earlier. about the energy transition. So, to sum up, China-Brazil relationship is central, and their economic links are thriving, not just on trade, also in investment.
Ambassador Jorge Heine, John Gong, thanks to both of you for joining us. Joining us now here with us in the studio is Otaviano Canuto. He is a senior fellow with the Policy Center for the New South and a former vice president at the World Bank. And from Leipzig, Germany, Benjamin Creutzfeldt is a China, Latin America-U.S. affairs analyst. Thanks to both of you for being with us. Otaviano, let's start right here in the studio. So President Xi pledged about $9 billion in credit to developing Latin American and Caribbean states, and this is focused on infrastructure development as well as clean energy. How important is this relationship between China and the CELAC nations?
It is quite important. The good news is that after a second phase of the Belt and Road Initiative, in which China pulled back a little bit from the financial flows, now it seems to have clearly, as anticipated by President Xi Jinping, entered a third phase. A third phase that will focus more on maybe smaller but more beautiful projects in clean energy, in technologically related sectors, as well as steel infrastructure. It was quite important to have the new port in Peru. Right. And the hope is that we might have, again, additional projects in that regard. Brazil would benefit, particularly, for instance, if a connection through the Pacific happens through infrastructure investments in the region. So it's good news because the presence of Chinese investments has been rising. Of course, the stock of capital in the region, it is still originally from Europe and the United States, but the participation of China is rising by the day.
You mentioned the benefits for Brazil from that port, the Shanghai port. President Lula is at the forum in Beijing. He's also on a state visit to China. We talked a moment ago with Ambassador Heine about the 20 agreements that have been signed in Beijing. Most of these focus on agricultural exports. How do you see the relationship evolve?
I guess the relationship has everything to keep deepening. Yeah. The complementarity between, on the one hand, the Brazilian or the regional exports of agriculture and minerals as well. Mm-hmm. Minerals are our new boy in the block, the lithium and other minerals from the region. Whereas, of course, the imports of manufactured goods, particularly more electronic goods and so on, is also rising from China. The ambassador mentioned the investments of BYD and in general electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles in Brazil, which is a shift relative to, let's say, the usual or the old Western European or American car makers in Brazil. So I guess also both on the agricultural side, both on the primary product side sold by countries in the region, and on the other, the imports, we have an evolving relationship that is getting bigger and bigger.
Okay, Benjamin, great to have you with us. Otaviano mentioned a moment ago the Belt and Road Initiative, the fact that it's now moved into phase 3. Well, the Colombian president, Gustavo Petro, is expected to sign a letter of intent to join that initiative. Colombia, of course, being a country that you are very familiar with. Well, let's listen to what President Petro had to say about that.
I think the Belt and Road Initiative permits the latest form of industrialization. That is what I want with this agreement for Colombia. So we, as strategic center of the world, can develop the infrastructure of artificial intelligence, and so that our youth can learn from it.
So, Benjamin, how will membership in the Belt and Road Initiative for Colombia benefit the country?
Oh, that's a big question. Very hard to tell. Colombia is a latecomer to the whole sort of China focus, focus that other countries in the region were far quicker to develop. Peru, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, a number of others that sort of have used this interest that China has expressed and has been paying for, you could say.
Yeah.
Many of them have got some advanced already developments in that region. Colombia is a latecomer, so in that sense, it's both symbolic in committing at this time in geopolitics that we observe for Colombia to sort of show its keen closing a gap there, keen interest in developing more with China and accepting more investment, more presence of Chinese companies, and so on. Yeah. So I think that's there's the symbolic aspect and also the catch-up that you see with others. At the same time, I heard the quote from President Petro earlier. He sounded a little out of breath after climbing the Great Wall and speaking, leaning on someone as he was speaking. And he, I couldn't quite figure out why he thought that somehow artificial intelligence would be the sort of immediate gap closing tool with China, but certainly, as my colleague just mentioned, the whole concept of Belt and Road Initiative has matured hugely, and it's no longer just about roads and highways and railroads. It's also about all the other manners of connecting people, goods, and countries. And in that sense, it's an exciting prospect that Colombia is on board with that.
Yeah, on that question of artificial intelligence, Benjamin, I'm guessing that the concern among many developing countries is that they might get left behind in the development of this very advanced technology, and that is something that President Petro wants to address. He doesn't want a sort of digital gap or digital divide to develop.
I would agree with that. Yeah, certainly that sense. Simply looking at a map of railroads or highways or anything of the world, you will find that despite attempts by, say, the British to build railroads through the jungle in southern Brazil or across the pampas of Argentina, it never really became a network the way you see it in Europe or in parts of East Asia or especially India. And so there is obviously that experience, that memory, somehow we're still not able to respond well to markets in remote areas. We're not well enough connected. And if the future highways, the digital highway and artificial intelligence, it's a good moment to latch onto that. So there is, of course, potential in that, no question.
Otaviano, the Belt and Road Initiative has resulted in 200 infrastructure projects, and it's created something like 1 million jobs. You mentioned the port in Peru, which is going to be very important for the entire continent. But where is the greatest need for infrastructure? In which sector is it? Is it mainly transport in Latin America? How do you see the BRI grow in the coming years?
Right. Definitely the region lags in terms of investment in logistics. Just to tell a short story, once the World Bank, where I was, made a study on why Brazil was so bright in soybeans, even starting to beat the Americans in productivity and in exports. And that was happening despite the fact that Brazil, at the time, first decade of the new millennium, was losing 30% of its soybeans production because of lack of storage and logistic good conditions. So definitely there is a gain in productivity that is to be accrued by having higher density of transportation and so on. So it still matters. But I want to highlight as well new areas. See the presence of Chinese investments in the region has gone beyond simply investments related to agriculture and primary products, and it's also been relevant in telecommunications, in managing infrastructure and electricity. That is the case in Brazil. And besides, of course, the support, the direct investment made by companies. So it's going beyond the presence of investments in China in the region, is diversifying a bit towards other areas, not simply the basic infrastructure. One thing also to take into account is the fact that we have this now, the CELAC, China-CELAC. We're going to have two other moments later in the year where China will relate, and probably with the presence of President Xi Jinping, which is the meeting of the OAS, of the Organization of American States, where China has been an observer since 2004, if I'm not mistaken, but also the meeting of the BRICS in Rio de Janeiro, because there is a high likelihood that the BRICS group will advance in the agenda of developing electronic payment systems and well, a bit of the use of local currencies, which is partial replacement of the U.S. dollar in commercial transactions, limited yet, but also the electronic compensation among central banks. This is quite important. So there is also this dimension of the relationship between China and the region that must be observed and developed.
Benjamin, I've got a little bit of time left. I want to talk about one very specific project that China is involved in Colombia, and that is the construction of the metro system in Bogota. There's a group of Chinese companies building that metro system. The first train is expected to be delivered in September. Then there'll be periodic deliveries, and it'll be a few months before the entire system is up and running. How is that going to change the capital in Colombia and basically the urban economy there?
Golly, that is a big one. It's very exciting. I was just taking pictures of the construction at various sites a couple of months ago, 6 weeks ago, and it's very exciting because Bogota is, I lived there for many years, is a city that is highly congested, very spread out. Over 10 million people live there, and the north and south are very poorly connected with various bus systems. So this is a huge step. It's also unusual for a Latin American city of that size, or probably a city anywhere in the world of that size, to have such poor public infrastructure. So it's going to move the city hopefully ahead and integrate communities that dispersed across the region. I think it's a very good and exciting move. I hope it works the way the planners have conceived it.
Okay, Benjamin Creutzfeldt, Otaviano Canuto, thanks to both of you for being with us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington.